All right. Whew. That took a while. That took a while. Looks like I'm the only one here so far. Hello, Brianna. We'll give everyone a couple minutes to get here since I was having technical difficulties. How was your week, Brianna? Eventful is good. What did you think about the first projects? Hello, Jamisa. Welcome aboard. I'll be right back. Well, we're moving on from the Civil War to the next step, which is the Gilded Age. Four people are here. Who else has joined us? We have Brianna, we have Jamisa. All right, we're going to start here in a minute. It's been 10 minutes since we started the stream, so everyone should be getting here. Oh, since you're on your computers, I'm just going to go over what is expected here in session number 2. We are going to be talking about the golden age of industry in the United States, also known as the Gilded Age. The outcomes of this session, once again, this is the lectures are to help supplement what you're supposed to learn. That is posted on Blackboard. So by the end of the session, students will be able to identify the roles of business leaders in unison with the rise of industry during this period, identify the impact and rise of capitalism on the industrial age and it had on making modern America. Discuss how the free markets bred competition that turned and brought about great technological innovation for the industrial age. Describe what was brought about by the progressive movement and how the progressive movement in the United States and how it affects modern America. So your readings for this week are the book, The History of the American People, page 511 to 611. Also read The Progressive Movement and the Transformation in American Politics. If you look on the assignment folder, you have a discussion, you have a position paper, and you have a comprehensive quiz. Taking a look at that. One moment, please. So your discussion is supposed to be about capitalism and the rise of industry. Your position paper, it will be written after you read about the progressive movement and the transformation of American politics. You can also use other resources to write a 2 to 4 page paper formatted accordingly to the APA style. And this includes at least 2 scholarly resources supporting or disagreeing with the statement. The rise of the progressive movement around the turn of the 20th century, the 1880s to 1910, shaped politics, culture, and economy in a negative way. Click on Session 2 position paper link to submit your assignment by the posted due date. Review the rubric available on due dates and grades on your grading criteria. So let's see, we are at 4 again. Not sure who joined us. So we're going to go ahead and get started here. I'm going to pull up the PowerPoint. So let me see if the PowerPoint comes up. There it is. All right, so please tell me if you can hear me and you can see the PowerPoint. Let me know if you can see me. Yes, Janisha says yes. Okay. That is the one in the affirmative, so we will go ahead and start then. So we're going to start here with the closing of the Western frontier. Now, the expansion to the West offered the United States a bounty of products that weren't available in other nations. The American forest offered lumber to build with. There was some lumber in the South, but the most abundant source came from the Northwest in Oregon and in Washington. So beef, it's what's for dinner. So the early Spanish colonists brought cattle to America. Many of these herds were allowed to wander freely in the Southwest, and they adapted some of these to be like the Texas Longhorn. They weren't worth a lot of money. Plus, these huge herds just wandering around the plains were kind of an annoyance. Until Texas ranchers discovered that these cattle, worth very little in Texas, were worth a lot of money back east. So they could get a lot of money for this cattle in Texas that was in Texas, as long as they could get it up to places like Chicago, New Orleans, and St. Louis. Basically, they started to herd the cattle that way. Problem is, that was pretty expensive, trying to get all the cattle there. So it was during and after the Civil War that this increase for this want of meat increased. So after the Civil War, the cattle industry changed. Cities in the North were industrialized and needed food for the influx of workers that had come in. Many meat packing companies were willing to pay top dollar for Texas beef. Another contributor to the growth of industry was the expansion of the railroads west. Ranchers could herd the animals at their railheads, where they could be taken to the slaughterhouses very quickly. Ranchers who could only get $3 a head in Texas were now getting about $50 a head from northern meat packers. So to drive these cattle north or to the railheads was not very easy. You're talking about days without water. In Kansas, it can be very hot. In the plains, it can be very hot. You also have Indians you have to overcome. But when you got there, you made a ton of money. So think of this as probably like your early version of the Deadliest Catch. It was very profitable. Like we said, $3 a head in Texas, $50 a head in the North once they got there. So you could make a pretty good buck. So driving these cattle from Texas up to the railheads, they varied in size on how big these cattle drives were. The average size was about 3,000 cattle controlled by 10 cowhands. They were usually in the saddle from sunrise to sunsets and only made about $30. Now you have to also remember this is in the 1800s, late 1800s, so $30 was worth a lot more than it is now. Cowhands owed most of their skills to the Mexican vaqueros who herded the cattle in Texas while it was still part of Mexico. They wore sombreros to protect their heads and skin from the sun, and leather chaps to protect from the bushes along the trail. They also gave us the words lariat, lasso, stampede, rodeo, and the corral call all came from the vaqueros. Usually drives would last between 2 to 3 months. Once at the railhead and back in civilization, cowhands would celebrate a successful drive. Many times their celebrations wouldn't please the townsfolk, and sometimes violence would happen. So they got done, they needed a drink, they got a drink, and things got out of control. So you have a lot of different cowboys, cowhands, buckaroos, vaqueros, that came from different backgrounds. Some were Mexicans, some were former slaves, and some were miners who did not strike it rich and had to become a cowhand to pay the bills. Am I going too fast? Am I going just fine? Let me know. So, during the Civil War, driving cattle from Texas to Kansas or Missouri was kind of frowned upon. Why do you think that is? Probably because Texas was part of the Confederacy and the United States didn't really want to trade with its enemy. But once the war was over, the ranchers took to pushing the cattle north again. The first railheads were 1,000 miles from Texas to the. It was about 1,000 miles from Texas to the Pacific or the Missouri Pacific Railhead in Sedalia, Missouri. That's known as the Sedalia Trail. You can see there on the map. Riding the Sedalia Trail did present its problems. Indians did attack, and it went through wooded areas, so some forest, and also crossed farmland. Most farmers didn't want their crops trampled by a bunch of cattle. So in 1867, an Illinois cattle dealer, Joseph McCoy, opened the Chisholm Trail. And you can see the Chisholm Trail there on your map on the PowerPoint. McCoy convinced the Kansas Pacific Railroad to open shipping pens, barns, and stables in Abilene, Kansas. He was also able to get lower rates on cattle shipments to the east. So by taking the Chisholm Trail, the cattle drive avoided wooded areas and took advantage of the grazing land of the Great Plains, or as it's also known as the open range, on their way to the railhead. So they were able to eat while they were going. Other trails opened as more railheads were established in the West. All right, we're going over to the next slide. So during long cattle drives, the cattle would always lose weight. So ranchers took advantage of the open areas of the northern plains to set up a range of ranches. These open range ranchers didn't usually own the land. They just owned a couple acres of land that surrounded their water source. So basically, they laid claim to all this land in the water and said that was their ranch, basically. On the Great Plains, there were very few water sources. Most of the water here on the Great Plains actually comes out of the Ogallala Aquifer, so you have to actually drill down to get water. So there aren't a whole lot of, there are some natural springs, but they're not a whole lot of them. So any rancher owning land around a water source would have exclusive use of thousands of acres surrounding their water. One rancher in Colorado controlled the size, or had a ranch basically the size of Connecticut and Rhode Island, even though he only actually owned 105 acres. By the end of the late 1880s, 4.5 million cattle were spread across the Great Plains, but as big as the Great Plains were, they couldn't handle all of the cattle. One thing is that cattle constantly eat and don't move away. So basically they will eat everything down to the dirt, whereas the buffalo were smart and they actually moved on. So they would move on and find better tasting food so the grass could recover after they were there. Cattle didn't do that. So it was in the winter of 1886 that a blizzard basically hit the southern and eastern plains, and 50 to 85% of the cattle died or starved to death. Following summer, there was a drought, so that finished off any of the open range cattle survivors. But the demand of beef was still there. So instead of letting the cattle wander, now the cattlemen created huge controlled ranches. With the railroads expanding and the Transcontinental Railroad finished, cattle drives became a thing of the past because basically you could put everything around the railhead. You just basically set up around the railhead, and driving them all the way from Texas, those days were over. Everyone's still doing all right? Not going too fast? So we kind of touched on this last week when we were talking about the pre-Civil War, how just after Mexico agreed to the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, that's when gold was discovered in California, and that started the gold rush to the west, also started the founding of California and its admission to the Union later. So the discovery of gold at Sutter's Mill in 1849 led to the California gold rush. A lot of the miners were hoping they would find new gold, but then when they couldn't find stuff there, found out there was a gold strike near Pikes Peak in Colorado in 1858. So they moved from California to Colorado. East and west, they came from Colorado, but they very rarely found anything. They're always looking for that mother lode, but usually mining takes a lot of work, and these guys weren't doing very well. In 1861, there was another gold strike in Idaho. Gold strikes in Montana and South Dakota soon followed. So in 1859, two miners discovered a vein of gold and silver in the Washoe Mountains in Nevada. They didn't realize what they had, so they sold their claim to Henry Comstock. The Comstock lode was full of gold and silver and turned out to be the greatest discovery in mining history. And by 1879, it had yielded $400 million worth of gold and silver. That's a lot of money, wouldn't you say? So we're talking about the Wild West. People back east didn't understand what was happening, so they would really want to know what's going on there. So Americans back east would pick up the dime novel and read about what life was like back in the tough and rumble West. Cowboys, miners, gamblers, prostitutes, many of these stories with these books were pretty close to the truth. The migration was driven by discovery of gold, silver, and other precious minerals, was different than other migrations that had been taking place in the past. Many times, disappointed miners would move around looking for new discoveries and open claims. Towns were created overnight, and new miners would see what they could come find. Many of these new towns had different names. Yeah, many of these new towns had interesting names like Whiskey Bar, Deadwood Gulch, Devil's Retreat, and Red Dog. Many times they started out as tents, then usually moved up quickly, and they just threw up really simple buildings. Towns usually had one main street and everything a hardworking miner would need: saloons, dancing halls, and gambling. And since the towns were thrown together so fast, usually many of them were very lawless, and many had to rely on themselves for protection. Very cool. Brianna went to Comstock. Hi. So these cities attracted many characters well known in American history, including Wild Bill Hickok, who came and died in the mining town of Deadwood, South Dakota. Wyatt Earp left Kansas to take advantage of the riches to be had in Tombstone, Arizona. Does anyone know what happened in Tombstone with the Earps? I know there's a bunch of little ghost towns in Colorado that I know of, well, I've heard of. I know one of them was called or I actually visited one of them called Geneva City. That was an old ghost town. It was kind of cool up there in the mountains. So yeah, Wild Bill Hickok, who was actually a marshal here in Kansas as well, went to go try to get some money, make his way and some money in South Dakota, and died. If anyone knows what the dead man's hand is, that is what Wild Bill was holding when he was shot and killed in Deadwood. So usually if you didn't find anything mining, so these towns would spring up and they would also collapse. So with the idea of such instant wealth so close, many came to the mining towns. Unfortunately, many of the minority groups faced bigotry. Blacks, Mexicans, and Chinese were forced to the bottom of society in those mining towns. Sometimes those towns would only or pass laws that where only whites were allowed. As fast as these cities were built up, they fell down. Now, some of these cities that actually made it are like San Francisco and Denver. Others, when the minerals dried up, the town did as well. So you have Virginia City, Nevada, that in 1876 had a population of 23,000. By 1889, when the Comstock lode dried up, the town shrunk to 9,000. By 1900, it only had 3,000. And as I was saying earlier, if you travel across the West, if you travel across the West, if you look hard enough for them, you're going to be able to find those mining towns sitting empty and returning to nature. I know along I-70 heading west into the mountains, you can see a ton of, when you're on your way up to the Eisenhower Tunnel, you can see a ton of old mining camps all the way up to Georgetown. Just look in the mountains, you can see the tailings from the mining. So the mining frontier basically started in 1849 and lasted until the discovery of gold in the Black Hills in 1875 and 76. The discoveries in the Western mining basically supplied the United States with the minerals, the precious metals they needed to ensure a sound financial basis that would back American currency. So we're talking about after the end of the Civil War, things are, it's kind of iffy, but all of a sudden we find all these minerals and all this precious metal that helped back our economy to help rebuild our country after the Civil War. Prospectors and settlers who remained permanently in the West helped to settle the region. At this time, there really wasn't a whole lot of settlement going on. It was still pretty empty, except for, the Native Americans who were already here. In 1858, there were few people living in the Rockies and there was no formal government. In the later years, so many people had moved west that Congress organized formal territories that would become states. Colorado becomes a state in 1876, Wyoming in the 1880s, Utah 1898, Nevada was, I believe, 1860. Maybe it was 1859. I'll have to check. They were part of the Union during the war. These territorial governments basically provided some sort of organization that helped cut down on all the crime and everything that was going on in these now new territories. So just quick questions for you, not really quiz time, but stuff you guys should remember. Cattle ranching was expensive. What changed the cattle industry after the Civil War? What were the trails or the Western trails in the cattle trails? So Sedalia, some others. What ended open range ranching? Where was gold discovered in 1849? And what was the Comstock lode? So these are possibilities that could be on your quiz. Just want to let you know that. All right, so we're going to switch back to me. Hello, everybody. So, excuse me. So everyone was able to keep up with that? Do good? Hold on. There we go. And I will be, making sure that you guys get this after we're done with it, of course. So I'm just getting the next one ready. Bear with me a second. Okay. So did anyone have any questions about the closing of the American frontier? I'm going to get a drink of water real quick. So does anyone have any questions so far? Okay, let's see here. Okay. So let me get this set up here. Give me 1 second. Thank you for your patience. All right, so now we're going to start with the Gilded Age. Now, the Gilded Age is an era following Reconstruction that is characterized by wealth and the rise of the industrial giants. These are also known as captains of industry. New industrial leaders that gave birth to large corporations like Rockefeller, Standard Oil, and Carnegie's Steel Company, also known as U.S. Steel. Some of them are also known as the robber barons. They're known as the robber barons because they used their wealth to destroy poor or smaller competitors. So during the Gilded Age, oops. Sorry. Okay. I'm going to get this eventually, so give me a second. Okay, back to this. Okay, so during the Gilded Age, factories needed new workers. Laborers began to organize and form unions because they were basically, they were working very hard and being used by these captains of industry to get rich themselves, but not actually get a whole lot of pay for that. So you have a lot of these. They needed cheap labor to help build railroads, transport goods, that these new industries were made, and farm the products that were grown. So the United States expands all the way to the west. Manifest Destiny is basically completed. So you have farmland open. You have industries opening up that need to ship their stuff west because everyone out west needs stuff from the east. So you have that going on. Most of this labor came from immigrants. Now, there was some serious problems with immigrants. You have the Chinese building the railroad, Irish coming over. So this is where you have nativist movements. People living in the United States the longest, resenting these newly arrived immigrants, began to push for laws that would control future immigration. Does any of this sound familiar to us? Something that's going on these days right now? In fact, they started a party called the Know Nothings Party that supported this position. Basically, it was a party that flourished in the 1850s. The Know Nothings Party was an outgrowth of the strong anti-immigration movement, especially an anti-Roman Catholic sentiment. We are a country that was founded by Protestants. The Mayflower, the Puritans, they were Protestant. They did not trust the church, the Roman Catholic Church, sorry. Make that differentiation. So they did not trust the Roman Catholic Church. And this started to manifest itself in the 1840s. So as some immigrants came over, primarily the Germans in the Midwest, my family came from Germany. My dad's side came from Germany. Came over in 1861 and moved to Iowa. And you also have the Irish in the East. They seem to pose an economic threat and a political threat to the native-born Protestants in America. Like I said, does any of this sound familiar? So we have Ulysses S. Grant. Now, Grant, we talked a little bit about him. He looks to most historians like a kind of mediocre president. But during his presidency, Reconstruction took place. He passed the 15th Amendment and the Amnesty Act, as well as the first Civil Rights Act. So, like we said, Reconstruction takes place under his presidency. He ratified the 15th Amendment, giving the freed slaves the right to vote. The Amnesty Act that normalized relations with the South. He signed the first Civil Rights Act following the ratification of the 14th Amendment. In 1872, he took on the Ku Klux Klan and pursued charging them with their crimes. Something good that we saw the Grant doing, like we said, Reconstruction, passing the first Civil Rights Amendments. There were a lot of problems Grant had. So these are some of the major ones that happened to President Grant. He was a great general, but like we said, a lot of historians figure him being a very mediocre president. So one of the first scandals that actually hit the Grant administration was Black Friday. And this is when gold speculation basically created a financial crisis in September of 1869. It was set up by Wall Street manipulators Jay Gould and James Fisk. Basically what they tried to do is corner the gold market and tricked Grant into preventing his Treasury Secretary from stopping it. However, to save this, Grant released large amounts of gold back onto the market, causing a large-scale financial crisis for many gold investors. Jay Gould had already prepared for this and quietly sold out, while James Fisk denied many agreements and hired thugs to intimidate his creditors. The Panic of 1873 hit the country hard during Grant's presidency, and he never attempted to try to alleviate all the problems that were going on. The first law he signed in March of 1869 established the value of the greenback currency during the Civil War, pledging to redeem these bills in gold. So the greenback is basically what we consider a dollar now. During the Civil War, there wasn't enough gold to actually be used as currency, so they used the greenback, the dollar bill, saying, this is backed, $1 is backed by one, ounce of gold, something like that. So that's the way they backed the currency. So now all these people that had all of this gold, all of these greenbacks were like, all right, I need the gold. So this is where President Grant is saying that the greenbacks are worth this much gold. In 1874, he vetoed a bill increasing the amount of legal tender currency, which diffused the whole financial crisis on Wall Street, but did little to help the economy as a whole. The Depression led to Democratic victories in the off elections of 1874, and the party took control of the House for the first time since 1856. Now, we also have to remember that during the Civil War, the Party of the South, basically everyone who was not everyone, but a lot of people who backed the South, who called for secession and did secede, were Democrats. So another one of Grant's scandals was the Whiskey Ring of 1875. Basically, this exposed the Secretary of the Treasury, Benjamin Bristow, in which over $3 million in taxes were stolen from the federal government with the aid of high government officials. Orville Babcock, the private secretary of the president, was indicted as a member of the ring, but escaped conviction because he was pardoned by President Grant. Grant stated, "Let no guilty man escape," rang hollow because he basically pardoned his secretary. Secretary of War William Belknap was discovered that he took bribes in exchange for the sale of Native American trading posts. Grant accepted his resignation, and after he was impeached, I'm getting my tongue tied here. Grant accepted his resignation, which allowed Belknap to resign and escape conviction, since he was about to be impeached by Congress. credit mobiler scandal in 1872 and 1873. Still here, sorry. So the credit mobiler scandal in 1872-1873 damaged the careers of several Gilded Age politicians. Major stockholders of the Union Pacific Railroad formed a company called Credit Mobiler America and gave contracts to the railroad, but they also sold or gave shares in the construction to influential congressmen. It was good for Congress because they helped themselves to approving federal subsidies for the cost of the railroad construction without having to pay much attention to expenses, which allowed the railroad builders to make huge profits. When the New York Sun broke the story on the eve of the 1872 election, the Speaker of the House, James Blaine, a Maine Republican, was implicated in the scandal and set up a congressional committee to investigate. The House censured 2 of its members who were involved in the scandal, Oakes Ames of Massachusetts and James Brooks of New York. During the affair, the outgoing Vice President Schuyler Colfax, the incoming Vice President Henry Wilson, and Representative James A. Garfield, who were all implicated in this scandal. Garfield denied the charges and was eventually later elected president. The scandal showed how corruption tainted Gilded Age politics and the length that the railroads and other economic interests would go to assure themselves to increase their profits. Although Grant did not profit from the corruption among his subordinates, he did not take any firm stance against them, even after they were found guilty of a lot of things. When his critics would complain, he would attack them. He was weak on his selection of subordinates. He was basically showing nepotism, hiring his friends, his favorite colleagues from the war, and he would pass over people who had more political experience. He alienated party leaders, giving many posts to his friends and political contributors rather than supporting the party's needs. His failure to establish a working alliance in Congress allowed those scandals to spin out of control. At the conclusion of his second term, Grant wrote to Congress that failures have been errors of judgment, not of intent. So that is General Grant. So are we doing all right? Are we moving too fast? Everyone can still hear me? We all still good? Shout out, let me know. All right. Let's take on the captains of industry, or robber barons. So our first person we're going to look at is Mr. Andrew Carnegie. Carnegie made his fortune from the steel industry, controlling most of the iron and steel operations. Two of his greatest innovations was the production of cheap steel for railroad lines. The second was vertical integration, something you want to remember. Vertical integration. Vertical integration means he acquired companies that provided the materials and services on which his companies depended on. So basically all the suppliers of the raw materials. So in the late 1880s, Carnegie Steel was the largest manufacturer of pig iron, steel rails, and coke in the world. In 1888, Carnegie bought rival Homestead Steelworks, which included an extensive plant served by tributary coal and iron fields, a 425-mile-long railway, and a line of lake steamships. Carnegie combined these assets and basically in 1892 launched the Carnegie Steel Corporation. He sold his business to United States Steel Corporation, started by J.P. Morgan. The sale earned him more than $200 million. This is $200 million back in the 1890s. So if you want to take a quick run to the internet and look up what $200 million in the 1890s would be worth now, the man was a very, very rich man. So at the age of 65, Carnegie decided to spend the rest of his days helping others. So all the money he made, he decided to give some back. While he began his philanthropy work, he basically started building libraries and making donations. Carnegie expanded his efforts in the early 20th century. So Carnegie was a devout reader. He donated approximately $5 million to the New York Public Library so the library could open several branches in 1901. He was devoted to learning. He established the Carnegie Institute of Technology in Pittsburgh, now known as Carnegie Mellon. In 1905, the Carnegie Foundation for Advancement of Teaching was founded. With his strong interest for peace, he owned the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in 1910. He made numerous donations, and it was said that more than 2,800 libraries were opened with his support. When I lived in the South, in a little town called Rome, Georgia, they actually had a library built in Georgia by Andrew Carnegie. Any questions about Mr. Andrew Carnegie? Also, he was an immigrant from Scotland. So if you have any questions or comments, just type them in there and I will take a look and we can talk about them. If not, moving on. Another robber baron or captain of industry was John D. Rockefeller. Rockefeller was born in New York in 1839. He started basically working at the age of 14. He embarked on several small business ventures as a teenager. He landed his first job at 16 as an assistant bookkeeper. By 20, Rockefeller was thriving in his job. He ventured out with his own business partner, working on as a commission merchant with hay, meats, and other grains and goods. At the close of his first year of business, he had already grossed $450,000. Rockefeller was a very careful businessman who didn't take unnecessary risks, and he decided to take a chance on the opportunity of the oil business in the early 1860s. So this is when we first find oil in the 1860s. We're not really sure what it's good for, except it burns and it's good and you can light lamps with it. So he decided to take a risk. So with oil production ramping up in western Pennsylvania, Rockefeller decided to establish an oil refinery near Cleveland, which was a little short distance from Pittsburgh. In 1863, he opened his first refinery, and within 2 years, it was the largest in the area. It didn't take much further to convince Rockefeller to turn his attention to oil. In 1870, Rockefeller and his associates incorporated the Standard Oil Company, which immediately prospered thanks to favorable economic and industrial conditions. So in the 1870s, this is when we are rebuilding the United States. Industry is ramping up, and it needs to be powered, and oil was a perfect way to power it. So with the economic and industry conditions moving up, Rockefeller streamlined his company's operations to keep margins high. He became more powerful with acquisitions, and Standard Oil began buying out its competitors. Standard Oil moves were so quick and sweeping that it controlled the majority of the refineries in Cleveland in 2 years. Standard then used its power in the region to make favorable deals with railroads to ship its oil. At the same time, Standard got into the business of purchasing pipelines and terminals and setting up a system of transport for its own products, controlling or owning almost every aspect of the business. So Standard Oil tightened its grip on the industry, even buying out thousands of acres of forest for lumber and blocking for drilling, basically building the oil derricks and blocking competitors from their own pipelines or running their own pipelines. As Standard got bigger, it bought up all of its competitors in other regions, soon pursuing basically wanting to be a coast-to-coast company. In just over a decade since Standard Oil was incorporated, it was a near monopoly in the oil business. Basically, if you got your oil in the United States, it was from Standard. Rockefeller oversaw all this. Everything that Rockefeller had done to this point created basically the first American monopoly or trust. It would serve as a guiding light for other big business to follow, basically. Whoops. This is where you get horizontal integration. Sorry, just getting back to my notes. So with him being so aggressive in the industry, the public and the Congress started to take note of Standard and were starting to wonder about it. It being a monopoly was not regarded kindly. He was basically taking over, pushing out competitors. And soon Standard became the epitome of a company growing too big and too dominant for the good of the public. Congress jumped into the fray in 1890 with the Sherman Antitrust Act, and 2 years later, the Ohio Supreme Court deemed that Standard Oil was a monopoly and was in violation of Ohio law. Always to be a step ahead of them, Rockefeller dissolved the corporation and allowed each property under the Standard banner to be run by others. Overall, the hierarchy remained chiefly in place, though Standard's board maintained control of the spun-off company. So basically, he sold, quotes, his companies, but was still basically in charge of them. Just 9 years after the company broke into pieces in the face of the antitrust legislation, those pieces were once again reassembled into a holding company. In 1911, the Supreme Court declared the new entity in violation of the Sherman Antitrust Act and illegal, and it was once again forced to dissolve. Now, what Rockefeller did with his money, he was a devout Baptist, and once he retired from his business at age 56, he kept himself busy with charitable endeavors, becoming one of the most respected philanthropists in history. His money helped pay for the creation of the University of Chicago in 1892, which he gave more than $80 million before his death. He also helped establish the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research, later named Rockefeller University in New York, as well as the Rockefeller Foundation. In total, he gave $530 million to various causes. Horizontal integration, once again, was the way Rockefeller expanded his company. It means one company controls other companies producing the same product. How are we doing? Are you confused? Am I going too fast? Okay. Moving on. We now move on to Cornelius Vanderbilt. Vanderbilt built railroads. So he was born actually very early. He was in our nation in 1894 in New York. At the age of 18, he was contracted by the U.S. government to supply outposts during the War of 1812. He learned of a threat to shipbuilding and navigation in open. He learned the art of shipbuilding and navigation in open water, and by the end of the war, he had amassed a small fleet of ships, basically ferrying passengers from Boston to Delaware. He was eventually given the name or the nickname Commodore, which he embraced. So he continued to build his empire, and soon he found out so basically the Civil War comes along and he donates his fleet to the Union Navy. By 1864, he had retired from shipping and amassed nearly $30 million in wealth. At the age of 70, he turned his attention to look more closely at acquiring railroads, like the Lincoln-Harlem-Hudson line that ran along the Erie Canal. Another one was the New York Central Railroad. I got lost in my notes again, sorry. Okay, found myself. Sorry about that. So during a horrible winter when the Erie Canal was frozen, he basically was able to cut off a lot of cities to the west because they weren't paying enough, which allowed him to buy the New York Central Railroad. And from there on, he basically controlled all rail traffic from New York City to Chicago. It was this conglomeration of railroads that basically revolutionized rail operations, standardizing procedures, timetables, and increasing the efficiency of of travel and decreasing travel times and shipment. So in 1871, Vanderbilt financed a monument to his empire, the Grand Central Depot. The terminal for the New York Central Railroad was constructed with features like elevated platforms, a glass balloon roof, and boarding areas that were only accessible to the passengers. At the city's insistence, the tracks were submerged below street level, so there was reduced noise and smoke. Towards the end of his life, Vanderbilt actually didn't want to pass his fortune along to charity. He had lived most of his life basically kind of modestly. Basically, what he really did was buy horses to placate himself. However, now in 1873, his wife introduced him to Reverend Holland Timmons McTire, who asked Vanderbilt to help him fund a Methodist university in Tennessee. Discussions went on for several years, and by the time of his death, Vanderbilt had promised a gift approaching $1 million that would become Vanderbilt, Tennessee. In his will, when he finally passed away, he had left over $90 million, the bulk of his estate, to his son, William Henry, who worked for his father's business, and $7.5 million to William's 4 sons. His other son received a $200,000 trust, and his wife and daughters received anywhere from $200,000 to $500,000 in stock. If we would have taken what he was worth then to today, he would have been worth over $200 billion. Calculating this wealth would basically be the gross domestic product of 1877. It would make him the second wealthiest person in American history after John D. Rockefeller. And you probably know some of Vanderbilt's descendants, like Gloria Vanderbilt and her son, Anderson Cooper. Vanderbilt built a tomb on Staten Island that cost over $1 million and was looked over by a full-time watchman at one time. Everyone still with me? So now we move to the rise of the labor movements. So we just talked about the robber barons, the captains of industry. Now we're going to talk about the labor movement, because a lot of their practices led to the labor movements building up here in the United States. So the labor movement grew out of the need to protect the common interests of workers. For those in the industrial sector, organized labor and unions fought for better wages, reasonable hours, and safer working conditions. Labor movements also led to the efforts to stop child labor, give health benefits, and to provide aid to workers who were injured on the job or had retired. So basically, we have some labor movements that start. One is known as the Knights of Labor. We also have another one most known as the National Labor Union, launched in 1866. The Knights of Labor basically reached its pinnacle of power in the mid-1880s. They were basically reform movements that seemed to be at odds with trade unionism. They're basically trying to, protect their workers. Oops, there it again, it's all right. So the history of labor and the rise of industry go hand in hand. Big business was making huge profit off of the workers. Workers would work long hours in terrible working conditions. So let's talk about what it was like to basically make steel. Steel is you melt iron, and the melting point of steel is very high. So it's also would be a dangerous job because you're dealing with molten metal. One reason why the light bulb was invented, because it was so dark, and to help the workers be able to see in this dark area would be light bulbs, because they would be running in 3 shifts, morning, noon, and night. You got to be able to see at night. Also, this is when your immigration or your immigrants really start to enter themselves into the workforce. Large immigrant pools of 18 million immigrants came to the United States between 1880 and 1910. Now, technology did improve and helped reduce the need for unskilled workers. It was at this time the United States pursued what is known as a laissez-faire capitalism policy. So basically, laissez-faire means the government doesn't do anything about regulating these businesses. American businesses could pursue their own interests without fear of government regulation. So basically, if you died on the job, or your company, you got injured on the job, and you tried to, say, hey, I got hurt, the company would say, that sucks for you. We'll go find someone else that can do your job. Also, another thing that came into this time was known as social Darwinism. Social Darwinism was believed by most business leaders. Social Darwinism is basically only the strong survive. They took that part of what was Darwinism and used it in business. So basically, if you are a strong company, you would survive. If you are a weak company, that's just the way the world works. That's what happens. Also, you could probably take that social Darwinism onto the floor of the business. So only the strong survive. If you fall down and get run over or get molten steel burn off your hand, too bad, buddy. So there were many. These are just some of the reasons why many workers didn't believe that they were getting their fair share. Yep, there we go. So we touched on one person name. We heard about him. That would be Jay Gould. Jay Gould was an American financier and also was a leading railroad developer and speculator. He is long vilified as an archetypal robber baron, and he became basically one of the 9th richest Americans in history. So taking a look at some of the stuff going on, oops, turn it, in the workers. So let's take a look at that. So we have Mr. Gould making his money off of the workers. So workers, what could they do? Basically, they could organize. Now, the first group of unskilled workers to form a labor union was in 1869. That was the Knights of Labor. Now, the Knights of Labor were not exclusive. They were open to all workers, blacks, women, and farmers. Why I mentioned Jay Gould is because at their peak, they had over 500,000 workers and successfully challenged Gould. The problem with the Knights of Labor is they couldn't maintain their strength and were taken over by a new union led by Samuel Gompers and the American Federation of Workers, or known as the AFL. The AFL was only open to skilled workers, so where the Knights of Labor was open to all workers, the AFL was open only to skilled workers. The AFL was looking to increase wages, reduce working hours, and improve working conditions. Basically, the only tool labor unions had for their workers to end the abuses of big business was to go on strike. So you can imagine 500,000 workers quit working. That would probably shut down a lot of things. Okay, so most of the strikes during this time turned violent. Once again, the government is not involved in maintaining this stuff. They're taking, like we said, a hands-off approach. So we have the Great Rail Strike of 1877, where the workers were upset with railroad owners for cutting their pay. So they went on strike, and the workers from Baltimore to Pittsburgh left their jobs. Violence between workers and the Pennsylvania State Militia broke out, and President Hayes sent in federal troops to end the strike. That makes sense because basically if the trains weren't running, a lot of stuff wasn't moving around, people, products, so the president went in and broke it. You have the Haymarket, not strike, but what happened at the Haymarket is a bomb was thrown into a labor meeting that had been called to discuss a strike taking place at the McCormick Harvester Company in Chicago. 9 were killed and 50 were injured. Massacre, sorry, the Haymarket Massacre. You have the strike at Homestead, where workers at Carnegie's Pittsburgh plants struck over wages, hours, and working conditions. Carnegie's business partner called out the Pinkerton detectives. Basically, the Pinkertons were a private army at this time. And fighting broke out between many of the workers. Many were killed or injured on both sides. The Homestead strike was the most violent. Carnegie and the union wouldn't compromise. Carnegie saw labor as a Judas, basically betraying him, while the public was critical of the facts that the workers had to resort to strike rather than things working out. The Pullman strike was led by Eugene V. Debs against the Pullman Railroad. If you've ever heard of Pullman Railroad cars, this is the company that made them. The strike spread across the nation, and other railroad workers refused to show up for work as support. Grover Cleveland sent in federal troops to break the strike because it was holding up the mail. Once again, it comes down to messing with stuff nationally. So it's during this time, after all these strikes, where you start to get labor reform. So like we were saying, there really was no government regulation until the reform movement in the early 1900s. Congress passes 2 measures that the government would step in to break up monopolies, a monopoly like Standard Oil. So one of the acts they passed is the Interstate Commerce Act in 1877, which established the Interstate Commerce Commission that put railroads on notice that if they were involved in activities that went beyond the border of one state, they could be regulated. So we're talking about the United States. You go outside of your state, you can be regulated. You also have the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890, defined a monopoly as a restraint of trade and made monopolies illegal. Also, the immigration changed during this time. So this is where you get the rise of nativism, and basically it's a whole different group of people that are coming over to the United States now. The first band of people that came over, the first wave of immigration, were people from like England, Ireland, and northern and western France, or northern and western Europe. Sorry. This new immigration was people coming from Italy, so Italian Catholics, Jews, Russians, and people from basically near Greece called the Southern Slavs. Also, they were showing up during a time of depression. So Jewish immigrants were targeted because of the way they looked with their beards. Anti-alien groups called for immigration restriction and attacked Catholic political control in the big cities. So in the cities, you had bosses that ran the cities. You started to attack those people. One of these groups was the American Protective Association, which grew up to be 500,000 members. Chinese immigration to California boomed during the gold rush in 1849. And you also had immigration from Japan. It wasn't until 1868 that really that's when the influx came from Japan to the United States. Now, there was a huge amount of anti-Chinese sentiment because basically the Japanese, when they would come here, moved here as a family and lived here as a family, where the Chinese would just basically come here, make their money, and go home. That was their plan. The Japanese assimilated to America and their clothing styles. Many joined the Methodist and Presbyterian churches. But as the population started to grow, people started to worry about this immigration from the Japanese. So in 1905, there was a lot of anti-Japanese rhetoric. One reason was because the Japanese had just fought in the Russo-Japanese War and defeated the Russians. So this was the first time an Eastern power, Japan, had beaten a Western power, Russia. So this started to worry people. So they came up with some policies in San Francisco. In 1905, the Japanese and Korean Exclusion League was established. The Japanese Exclusion League established 4 policies in 1905. The extension of the Chinese Exclusion Act that would include Japanese and Koreans. So basically, we already are keeping control of the Chinese. Now we're going to do it for the Japanese and Koreans. The exclusion of league members by Japanese employees and the hiring of firms that employ Japanese. The initiation of pressure on the school board to segregate Japanese children from white children. Initiate a propaganda campaign to inform Congress and the president of this menace. And the problem also was that the Japanese lived throughout the city, just not in Chinatown like the Chinese. So tensions were rising between Tokyo and San Francisco, like I said, especially after the Japanese defeated the Russians in the Russo-Japanese War. They demanded to be treated as equals. As a result, there is communication between Japan and the United States from 1907 to 1908. There was in 1906, San Francisco, California Board of Education passed regulations where children of Japanese descent were required to separate and be in specific schools. At the time, Japanese immigrants made up approximately 1% of the population of California, and many had immigrated before this treaty was made in 1894. Which had allowed free immigration from Japan. So you can see how this is building up to turn into something that the United States is still dealing with even today. Different people immigrating, but still the same problem. So you have the growth of urban areas, urbanization. You have living conditions weren't real great. You have the political machines, and you have an overall rise of the standard of living in these urban areas. So that is what's known as the Gilded Age. So let's take a quick 5-minute break. It is 6:28. So let's be back at 6:33. And we will go ahead and finish up our lecture for tonight. Okay, so guys, go ahead and take a break. 6:33. Make sure you come back, chime back in, and we will get to the last part of our lecture for tonight. Okay? So I'll see you here shortly. All right. Got about a minute. So let me know when you guys are back in and we'll get started. So just let me know when you're back. I'm going to step away for a second. Welcome back. Okay. So we are going to finish up this lecture here. So we've talked about the closing of the American West frontier. We talked about the Gilded Age. We're now going to move on to also what was going on during the Gilded Age in this time, which is what I call the days of McKinley. Hold on 1 second. Got to get everything lined up here. All right. So the days of McKinley is when you start to see the United States exercising itself as a world power. So 1896 to 1903. So you have the election of 1892. The Republicans and Democrats face a challenge from what is now known as the Populist Party. Republicans nominate President Benjamin Harrison, who won the election in 1888 and defeated Democratic former President Grover Cleveland. The Populists put up Mr. James Weaver. Populists campaigned on unlimited cheap silver money, government ownership of all railroads and telephone companies, a graduated income tax, and direct election of U.S. senators, single-term limits for presidents, immigration restrictions, and shorter workdays. So during this election, Cleveland is reelected as president. He is the only president to be elected to 2 non-consecutive terms. Cleveland was welcomed back to the White House with a depression. So the Depression of 1893. The Depression of 1893, investors had traded their silver for gold in a scheme that depleted the nation's gold reserves below $100 million. If this continued, the government wouldn't have enough gold to back the paper money in circulation, what President Grant did backing the greenbacks. Cleveland addressed the situation by repealing the 1890 Sherman Silver Act. Now, what is the Sherman Silver Act, you ask? The Sherman Silver Act, Purchase Act, was enacted in 1890, requiring that the amount of silver the government, or increase the amount of silver the government was required to purchase each month. Sherman Silver Purchase Act had been passed in response to the growing complaints of farmers. Farmers had immense debts that could not be paid off because of a series of droughts, and they urged the government to pass the Sherman Silver Purchase Act in order to boost the economy. However, this led to inflation and contributed to the Panic of 1893. After the Panic of 1893 broke, President Cleveland oversaw the repeal of the act in 1890. Oversaw the repeal of the act to prevent the depletion of the country's gold reserves. It didn't work. In 1894, the government only had $41 million in the treasury. So here is an interesting turn of events that I think is kind of crazy. Darn it. Hold on 1 second. Sorry, everybody. Sorry. So, back on track. So it didn't work. 1894, the government only has $41 million left in the treasury. President Cleveland and Congress went to J.P. Morgan to bail them out. So Morgan agreed to loan the government $62 million to put it back on its feet. So fast forward almost 100 years. So you can see this 93, so maybe fast forward more than 100 years when the U.S. government had to come and bail out Morgan Stanley. Interesting dichotomy, difference of things going on there. So the Depression and the repealing of the Sherman-Silver Act made the populace even stronger. More Democrats joined the Populist Party in hopes of winning free silver and more power for the people. Coxey's army was a protest led by unemployed workers from the United States, led by the populist leader Jacob Coxey. They marched on Washington, D.C. in 1894. It was the first significant popular protest march on Washington. The purpose of the march was to protest the unemployment caused by the Panic of 1893 and to lobby the government to create jobs that would involve building roads and other public improvements. Does that sound like what might be taking place a little bit later from another president? Some of the more militant Coxeyites were those who formed their own armies in the Pacific Northwest. Many protesters were unemployed railroad workers who blamed railroad companies, President Cleveland's monetary policies, and excessive freight rates for their plight. The climax of this movement took place on April 21st, 1894, when William Hogan and approximately 500 followers commandeered the Northern Pacific Railway train for their trek to Washington. They enjoyed support along the way, which enabled them to fight off federal marshals attempting to stop them. Federal troops finally apprehended and stopped the march. It was also during this time that we almost went to war again with England, with Great Britain. So it was during Grover Cleveland's second term that the United States nearly went to war with Great Britain, and it didn't even involve any U.S. territory. This was in South America. The nation of Venezuela and the British colony of Guyana claimed an area of land which was rich in gold ore on their border. Cleveland pointed out that the Monroe Doctrine, and do we remember what the Monroe Doctrine is? Basically, that the Americas was no longer open to British colonization. Cleveland threatened war if the British didn't back off, but the British did. They conceded. Cleveland's stance impressed many of the Latin and South American countries who began to see the United States as a protector. This is something that they saw in good light at one time, but as we continue to go through this, we're going to see that eventually a lot of these Latin American and South American countries are not going to see the United States in that light much for a while. But that's coming later. So by 1896, Cleveland had no chance for re-election. He failed to end the Depression and had to look out for outside help to keep the Treasury full. As the election approached, the Democrats looked to William Jennings Bryan to carry their banner. Brian is from Nebraska. He's 35 years old, which is the minimum age to run and serve for president. He served in Congress for 2 years, but did very little. Back home, he was a well-known speaker. He barnstormed throughout the West, speaking of free coinage of silver. On the campaign trail, Brian's cross of gold speech drew them in, and he rehashed the arguments for silver attacking those who pushed for the gold standard. Oops. So you can see there is a quote from the Cross of Gold speech. Having behind us the producing masses of this nation and the world, supported by commercial interests, the laboring interests, and the toilers everywhere, we will answer their demand for a gold standard by saying to them, you shall not press down upon the brow of labor this crown of thorns. You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold. Very fire and brimstony. So that is who is running on the Democratic side. On the Republican side, the Republicans choose William McKinley from Ohio. He is the embodiment of what they believed is conservatism, prudence, respectability, and sobriety. McKinley's biggest supporter was Mark Hanna. Mark Hanna is older than McKinley and had made his money with the Rockefellers in coal and iron. Hanna fears these new socialist movements within industry, and his goal is to make McKinley president. McKinley used Hanna and his contacts, and Hanna's people got bankers and industrialists to write big checks for the McKinley campaign. So before the 1896 campaign, presidential candidates didn't tour the country looking for people's votes. It was seen as below the office. When Andrew Johnson hit the presidential stump in 1866 for congressional candidates, one of his opponents said he was speechifying and was not fit to be president. So this is where you really start seeing the change, where you start seeing them campaigning for the job. Brian traveled 13,000 miles by train and delivered 600 speeches in 14 weeks, sometimes giving 6 speeches a day. Brian's campaign worried the Republicans, their banker and industrial allies. This worry drove bankers and industrials to McKinley and Hanna. He got a lot of money from Republicans and conservative Democrats. Hanna used this money for posters, buttons, and rallies. Hanna was so good at fundraising, he actually returned contributions that McKinley didn't need. Wouldn't that be nice to happen now? Where Brian was running around the country, McKinley had people come to his house in Ohio. Nearly 750,000 750,000 people visited his home. The election of 1896 is considered one of the most dramatic in American history. The 1896 campaign is often considered a realigning election. McKinley forged a coalition of businessmen, professionals, skilled factory workers, and prosperous farmers that were heavily represented. He was strongest in the Northeast, the upper Midwest, and the Pacific Coast states. Brian was the nominee for the Democrats, the Populist Party, and the Silver Republicans. He was strongest in the South, the rural Midwest, and the Rocky Mountain states. Economic issues were crucial, and Mark Hanna invented many modern campaign techniques and had a $3.5 million budget. He outspent Bryant by a factor of 5, so 1 to 5. So, kind of interesting with our election coming up here in 3 weeks. Looking back on this election, seeing any parallels between our current election and the one coming up here. So in September, it looked like Bryan was going to win this thing. By the end of the 1896 campaign, Bryan had secured 6.5 million votes. McKinley got 7 million votes and won the electoral vote 271 to 176. And this was the first time in 25 years that a presidential candidate won an absolute majority. So how did Bryan lose the election? His base was in the South and the West. Those states had very few electoral votes. So another thing that you need to do when you're running for president is win the states where the population is. So New York, Pennsylvania, Texas, California. You need the states that have the most people in it. You can win all the Rhode Islands you want, but they only have 1 or 2 electoral votes. McKinley also won in the Northeast and the swing states that were up for grabs since the Civil War. Since Bryan didn't have the support of workers or city dwellers, he also didn't help himself by calling New York enemy country. And with this defeat, the populist ideas slowly started to fade away. The fortune of farmers began to change. Crops began to rise, as did farm income. New gold strikes in Canada and Alaska added to the treasury. European countries were now increasing their demand for American wheat and corn. Populism was still popular in the South, where cotton prices were still low, and cotton and Southern farmers were barely making it. So speaking of what was going on in the South, we're going to talk about Jim Crow segregation. So with the defeat of populism, and who would have benefited from populism's victory would have been farmers and workers, the South began to change. So this is 30 years after the end of the Civil War. Pro-civil rights Republicans were growing old and dying off. Many new Republicans didn't care about civil rights for blacks and had lost interest. With the Republicans losing their power in the South, the Southern Democrats moved to ban blacks from voting. So I'm just going to pause real quick and make sure everyone's still doing good. We all good still? So in the 1890s, mobs would make sure that Jim Crow segregation was enforced. Now, the Jim Crow laws would be established in the 1870s and carry on until the 1960s. Jim Crow segregation just wasn't a set of laws, but became a way of life. Jim Crow system made blacks second-class citizens, and if they wanted to do something, they would have to have the permission of a white person. So some of the rules of the Jim Crow South: a black male could not offer to shake hands with a white male because it would imply that they're equal. Blacks were introduced to whites, never whites to blacks. Whites didn't use courtesy titles or respect, such as Mr., Mrs., Miss, Sir, or Ma'am, when referring to blacks. Instead, they used their first names. Blacks had to use courtesy titles. So once the blacks were told how to act, many Southern politicians went after their rights to vote. Testing laws prevented them from voting. They approved a poll tax of $1 or $2 each year. If they skipped an election, once they came back, they would have to pay for the elections that they skipped. So if you didn't vote in the 1896 election, when you voted in the 1900 election, you had to pay for the 1896 election. You also have states using literacy tests to keep blacks from voting. Grandfather clauses stated that if a man's grandfather had the right to vote before radical Reconstruction, he didn't have to pay the tax. The problem is, no man had the right to vote before 1867. So probably one of the worst things that happened in our history is the time of lynching. This happened a lot in this time. In fact, it still sort of continues on. So most of the time, lynching took place when a violent act was committed by a black person. If a black man was challenged the laws of Jim Crow, he was usually lynched. In 1890, 85 blacks were lynched in the United States, and nearly all of them in the South. Lynch mobs had no fear in getting caught. They usually posed for the cameras, many times with law enforcement, and many times law enforcement turned a blind eye to it, as you can see in that picture. So I want you to think about this. Why do you think that the blacks allowed this kind of treatment to be forced upon them? So it's also during this time that you have one of the great leaders of the Black cause, Frederick Douglass, dying in 1895. This is where you also have a next generation stepping up to help become a new voice of the African Americans. One of these gentlemen is Booker T. Washington. He saw all the advancements that have been made since the end of the Civil War were basically being taken away. Booker T. Washington used a convention in Atlanta that was aimed at rich Southerners to create a deal between the two races that would help both of them out. Washington would accept that blacks are socially inferior if Southern state governments would fund agricultural and technical schools for blacks, keeping blacks in their place as farmers and laborers. This idea satisfied many white Southerners, but it also attracted blacks. A voice against the Atlanta Compromise was W.E.B. Du Bois. He wanted to fight for the social and civil equality for blacks. He wanted blacks to become skilled workers in the field of medicine and law. Washington didn't have a problem with that goal. He just knew the situation for most blacks in the United States and did not really think it was going to work out. In 1890, the state of Louisiana passes a law that requires separate places on trains and in depots for blacks and whites. A large group of blacks looked to challenge the law. The challenge of the law reached the Supreme Court, and in a 7-1 decision, the court sided with Louisiana. Second-class citizenship was confirmed for all blacks. So we have the Dred Scott case in 1857, which confirmed that they were property. We fight a civil war over it. And what comes next is we confirm that all blacks are second-class citizens. This will go on until the early or mid 50s, early 60s with the civil rights movement. So now we're going to move on to another part called American Empire. So the United States basically had conquered the West. Manifest Destiny was made, but we still needed more. So we continued to push outward. So after the Civil War, Americans turned inward to settle problems at home. They rebuilt the South and settled the West, built railroads, and expanded the industrial system. By the 1890s, the United States had passed Great Britain as the premier industrial nation. But with this expansion came problems like the populist movement, free silver, the labor disputes. Many politicians were looking for an aggressive foreign policy to redirect American minds from the problems at home. So basically, we go after someone else and we don't worry, or we forget about what's going on right here in our own backyard. So some of the territories that come under control of the United States during this time is the Hawaiian Islands, the Philippines, Cuba, Puerto Rico, and Panama. These are just some of the imperial holdings of the United States. We're a commercial and industrial giant. We're going to talk about anti-colonialism, frontiers, Anglo-Saxons, and ships. So the quantity of American exports to other countries changed the trading relations and directed attention of American leaders to the importance of foreign markets in securing foreign colonies. It was this expansion of American goods that prompted Senator Albert Beveridge to say in 1899, "We are raising more than we can consume. Today we are making more than we can use. Therefore, we must find new markets for our produce and new occupation for our capital and new work for our labor." So exports increased to $168 billion. Oops, turn it. So American exports to carry or send as a commodity to some other place as another country in 1870 was 392 million. American exports in 1890 was 857 million. American exports by 1900 was $1,394,000,000. So you can see we were expanding our exports quite a bit. Once again, a huge change to the way it is these days. Oh, sorry. So one of the biggest proponents of American expansion was Henry Cabot Lodge, and at the end of the 19th century, Europe had carved out colonies in Africa for themselves and were now looking to the Far East and the weak Chinese Empire. Lodge argued that the United States must not fall out of the line of march. Other thoughts and ideas that had influenced the United States towards empire are social Darwinism. We talked about that. Social Darwinism is a theory that competition among individuals, groups, and nations or ideas drives social evolution in human societies. The term draws on the common use of the term Darwinism, which refers to the various evolutionary ideas and the idea of survival of the fittest. in populations as the outcome of competition between individual organisms for limited resources. A man named John Fiske and Josiah Strong stated that in 1885, the English-speaking races would eventually control every land that was not already the seat of established civilization. Frederick Jackson Turner, a historian, offered a thesis on the close of the frontier in the United States. Officially, the frontier of the United States was closed, according to the government, in 1890. And the frontier was key to American democracy, social stability, and prosperity. Now that the frontier was closed, the United States would turn into a European nation, racked with social and class conflicts. And you can see that's sort of already going on because the industrial workers, blacks, and immigrants were already fighting, or we were having these things come up. And then in 1890, also a naval captain named Alfred Thayer Mahan wrote The Influence of Sea Power Upon History. He argued that all great powers throughout history had one thing in common, a powerful navy. During this time, this is when the most powerful navy in the world was the British Navy. The British Navy had a huge empire to protect. That's why they had to have a strong navy, because it was an overseas empire. Something else that comes up during this time is anti-colonialism. Now, what is anti-colonialism? Oops, sorry. So anti-colonialism is counter to expanding the American empire. So all of these things are pushing the United States towards establishing itself as a world power. But the United States had something that these other empires didn't. That's a military. We had fought a civil war. We decided by that time most of our military was, after the war, was focused on conquering the West and the Indians. We didn't really have a huge navy at the time, so we weren't really built to be an empire. There was no need for a military in the United States. Canada was a friend, and the border had been established through treaties. When there were problems with Mexico, the United States didn't need a huge army to deal with it. They also were protected by 2 oceans. When McKinley took office, there were fewer than 30,000 men in the Army and the Navy. The British were the true imperial power that had 10 times that size of armed forces. The armed forces of Germany, France, and Russia were even bigger than Great Britain's. So the anti-colonial sentiment was that the United States was founded in rebellion against empire and had always been against heavy-handed imperial ways. The Americans saw Europe and its imperial powers as one of the problems with the old world that the United States had left behind. McKinley basically said America's anti-imperialism at his inauguration address is we must avoid the temptation of territorial expansion. How long did that last? So, question for you guys. What do you know about the Spanish Empire? Late 1800s. What do you know about the Spanish Empire? So the Spanish Empire found and settled the New World because they were looking for India and ran into the New World, looked to convert the Indians to Christianity as well as getting the gold, and at one time was the most powerful empire on the planet. By 1895, the empire was down to Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. At this time in Cuba, there was an open rebellion going on. And like any guerrilla war, the Spanish controlled the cities. The countryside was held by the rebels. They would attack at night, and both sides were very brutal. So at this time, basically your internet and the way you got your information was through newspapers. And in order to sell newspapers, we have two newspaper sellers, Joseph Pulitzer and William Randolph Hearst, and they needed to enhance the stories so people would buy newspapers. Like we just said, the way people got their news back in 1896 was basically the newspaper. There was no radio yet, no TV, definitely no internet. So newspapers were the way that people got their news. And newspapers did anything, and I do mean anything, to get people to read their papers. So we saw on the slide a little bit earlier something called the Yellow Kid. This is where the term yellow journalism or yellow press comes from. Hearst and Pulitzer papers ran the first comic strip known as the Yellow Kid. Writers would squeeze the most they could from a story. Basically, they were kind of like tabloids like the Star and the National Enquirer today. Journalists for these papers were in Cuba and squeezed as much juicy details as they could out of the rebellion, the Cuban rebellion. They called the military commander of Cuba, Verilano Weyler, the Butcher, telling of his exploits against the Cuban people. It wasn't enough for them. They needed more. If it bleeds, it leads. Hearst sent Frederick Remington, a famous artist, to Havana to get pictures. When Remington said it was all quiet here and he wanted to come home, Hearst told him, "You furnish the pictures, I'll furnish the war." The problem is McKinley didn't want a war. There were $50 million in American investments in Cuba. He didn't like the way the Spanish authorities were treating the Cubans, but if the Cubans won, think about the populism thing and what populism was going to grant to these people, the American farmers, that kind of stuff. So McKinley was just hoping for the best and talked to the Spanish. The Spanish agreed with McKinley that they would remove Weyler and proposed autonomy for Cuba within the Spanish Empire, and everything looked like it was going to work out okay, that the Spanish were going to be able to keep their empire, and everything was going to be all right. The problem is it didn't. McKinley took a month and a half making demands on the Spanish to change their policies. His advisor, Mark Hanna, advised against the war. Spain agreed to everything that McKinley asked for, but the nation was so fired up by the newspapers and the yellow journalism that McKinley gave in. He rejected the Spanish submission, and on April 11th, 1898, he asked Congress for a declaration of war and got it. So let's look back on what happens. So basically, Hearst publishes a letter from the Spanish ambassador to Washington saying that McKinley was weak and a bidder for the admiration of the crown. Then the United States, just to make sure that they are protecting U.S. interests, sail a battleship, the USS Maine, into Havana Harbor. After they do that, it's on the 15th of February 1898, the Maine explodes, killing 260 men. So, true or false, did the Spanish blow up the Maine? What do you guys think? Did the Spanish blow up the Maine? Please type your answers in the chat box. So, did the Spanish blow up the Maine? The answer is no. It's been found out through false, correct, Jamisa, that basically what happened was all of these, get my train of thought back on the tracks. Basically what happened was that they put a ammunition magazine next to where they stored the coal. When you put a spark in the coal, it burns. This ship is made of steel. It heats up. Basically, it heated up the magazine. It set off the shells that were in the magazine. It explodes. The Maine explodes. 260 men die. At that time, they didn't know that. They figured that the Spanish placed a mine next to the Maine to destroy it. This basically starts what is going to be known as the Spanish-American War. The Spanish-American War lasts from April to August 1898 and is called a splendid little war. So that is going to do it for our lectures tonight. We're going to stop it there at the Spanish-American War. So, does anyone have any questions? Now, you can get a hold of me through email, as usual, if you have any questions. Very sure. Well, you did have a 50-50 shot. So once again, make sure you go to Blackboard and you look over it to see what you need to do. And we said we have the discussion, which is on capitalism and the rise of industry. We have a paper that will be due, which is you need to read the Progressive Movement and Transformation of American Politics link on Blackboard and write a 2 to 4 page paper formatted according to the APA style that includes at least 2 scholarly sources supporting or disagreeing with the following statement: the rise of the progressive movement at the turn of the century, 1880 to 1910, shaped the politics, culture, and the economy of the United States in a negative way. So also, when it comes to writing papers, make sure that you do not use Wikipedia as your source. Wikipedia is a good way to find the source, But what I want you to do is to, when you see that it is footnoted, go down to that footnote and use that as your source. I will count off if you use Wikipedia as your source. I want you to mine deeper for that information. Like I said, when you go to Wikipedia and you find the footnote that says where that source came from, make sure you use that link as the source. Do not use the Wikipedia link as your source. I will count off for that. Yes, I will be posting the slides. I couldn't post them on Blackboard. I will try to post them on Blackboard. If not, I will go ahead and just send it out in a mass email along with the lecture. So does anyone have any questions? Any questions? No questions? Okay. That's going to do it for us tonight. Like we said, if you have any questions, you can email them to me. And I look forward to reading your papers. Hope you have a great week. And I will see you next Monday. So have a good one. Have a good week, everybody. We'll see you next Monday. Wait, what time is it? 5 o'clock. 5 o'clock. It's a Monday. Bye, everybody. Thanks for tuning in.